Continuing with the stomach, let's now look at the production of hydrochloric acid by parietal cells. Parietal cells are a specific type of cell in the lining of the stomach that's responsible for producing stomach acid as well as intrinsic factor. In these two drawings, we see on one side how that acid is produced. On the right side are the stimuli that are involved in stimulating the production of the acid. Let's first look at how hydrochloric acid is secreted into the lumen of the stomach. The parietal cell has a number of transport channels. The most important ones we're going to look at are the proton pumps, which are shown here in the drawing, and then you'll notice the key down below. The proton pumps actually move the protons, or the hydrogen ions, from within the parietal cell into the lumen of the stomach. And it actually exchanges those hydrogen ions for potassium ions. Following the movement of these hydrogen ions are chloride ions through a different channel in the membrane of the parietal cell. You'll notice that on the right side, it's the same drawing showing the parietal cell and the lumen of the stomach, but on this side of the cell are where the receptors are. The receptors are for acetylcholine, gastrin, and histamine. Those are the three primary molecules responsible for telling that parietal cell when to produce hydrochloric acid. Acetylcholine is the neurotransmitter released by the vagus nerve. Gastrin is a hormone, and histamine acts as more of a local hormone. We've learned about histamine and its role in allergic reactions, but the histamine here is a completely separate job. This histamine interacts with a receptor on the parietal cell known as H2 receptors. The histamine involved in allergic reactions activates H1 receptors. So knowing these two pictures, now we can understand a little bit more about how we treat gastroesophageal reflux disease, or commonly referred to as stomach acid. One option is to take antacids like Tums, Rolaids, Maalox. There's a number of buffers that are used, and these buffers are often a calcium carbonate based buffer that can be given to just try to neutralize some of that acidity inside the lumen of the stomach. There are proton pump inhibitors like omeprazole or Prilosec, and those are pretty strong acid reducers because they get right to the source. They're going to block the proton pumps and therefore block the production of the acid directly by inhibiting those proton pumps. A third route to treat heartburn are H2 blockers. H2 blockers block only the histamine involved in stimulating the parietal cell. You've probably heard of Tagamet, Pepcid, and Zantac are three very common H2 blockers. Now the H2 blockers don't work as well on the acid that's getting stimulated when there's food in your stomach. Because when there's food in your stomach, the prime mechanism to stimulate stomach acid is the vagus nerve, acetylcholine, and gastrin. But H2 blockers will reduce the stomach acid when you're not actively eating food, so maybe throughout the evening and in between meals. There's a number of other things to do to reduce stomach acid. One, eat smaller meals. There's certain things in food that tend to exacerbate or make heartburn worse. Some things that are notorious for stimulating heartburn would be fatty acids, high-fat diets. There's also things like mint that can actually make stomach acid worse. You can make sure that you're standing upright after a meal. If you lay down, that lack of the gravity keeping the acid in the stomach. But these are very common medications used to treat heartburn or GERD. This is our histology drawing of the lining of the stomach. You'll notice again we have the mucosa, the submucosa, the muscularis, and the serosa on the outer surface of the stomach. A couple things to point out that are different compared to other parts of the GI tract are the gastric pits, which are these microscopic little pits in the lining, and deep down in the pits are where we often find the different types of cells that are either making the stomach acid, like the parietal cells. The chief cells are going to be producing some of the enzymes, like pepsin and gastric lipase. You'll notice there's a cell called the G cell, which is going to be synthesizing and secreting gastrin, the hormone that goes into the bloodstream. And then there's some mucus-producing cells as well. So gastric pits are pretty specific for the stomach. There's an additional layer of smooth muscle in the stomach compared to the rest of the GI tract. So it has an oblique layer as well as the typical circular and longitudinal layers. Here's just another figure in your book showing the specific cell types that line this gastric pit. We've definitely talked about the parietal cells that are producing hydrochloric acid and intrinsic factor. The stomach uses a different cell to make its enzymes, pepsinogen, which is the inactive version of pepsin. So what's interesting is pepsin has to be activated by stomach acid. If you had a cell here producing a protease, it might digest normal proteins in the cell. So you have to make this enzyme inactive, and then once it enters the lumen, the acidity turns it into pepsin, and then it can start to digest protein. Then we see a G cell producing the hormone gastrin. Next topic is what we call phases of digestion. This information in your textbook comes kind of at the end of the chapter, but I like to talk about it now because it largely has to do with your stomach and how do we stimulate it, how do we turn it on, how do we keep it on, and then how do we turn the stomach off. That's basically the three phases of digestion. The first one is known as the cephalic phase. We know cephalic pertains to your head. So there are things in your head that activate your digestive system. It does this by preparing your mouth for the food as well as your stomach. And what we mean by things in your head, you have a lot of sensory structures in your head. You've got smell, so olfaction, sight, vision of food, just thinking about food, and then that moment you taste food. Those are the stimuli in your head that activate neural centers in your cerebral cortex, hypothalamus, and brainstem. Then those parts of the brain are going to send nerve impulses to salivary glands in order to start to prepare the mouth. So the facial nerve and the glossopharyngeal nerve stimulate your saliva. The vagus nerve is going to begin stimulating the stomach, and that stomach is going to begin to produce stomach acid, like we just saw, but also start to produce some of the enzymes. The next phase, if you think about it, once you've started to eat food, let's say you ate your entire meal, and now your entire meal is in your stomach. Phase one doesn't really work anymore, the cephalic phase, right? If you smell food when you're already full, when you see food when you're already full, when you think about food, and when you taste more food, it doesn't really do what it used to when you already have food in the stomach. But you still need to keep that stomach secreting enzymes and secreting acid. So the gastric phase is more the stomach stimulating the stomach. So the stomach has stretch receptors and chemoreceptors. And now, as long as there's food and material in the stomach, it'll keep that stomach active. It'll continue the secretion of the acids. It'll continue the motility, which is the muscle contractions of the stomach. And it'll stimulate that stomach to move that material into the small intestine. So this is known as the gastric phase. It's stimulation of the stomach when there's food in the stomach. The third phase is called the intestinal phase. This is the phase where we reduce the gastric activities because the stomach has emptied, but promote more activities related to the small intestine. So what happens here is you have a nervous system effect. The small intestine now will detect that there's contents in it by stretching, but also by detecting chemicals. The small intestine will inhibit the parasympathetic stimulation of the stomach. So the stomach is going to be turned down by inhibiting parasympathetic and increasing sympathetic stimulation of the stomach. So during the intestinal phase, the stomach activities decline, but we're going to start to stimulate the small intestine as well as organs that are going to help the small intestine. Those include the liver, the gallbladder, and the pancreas. So the small intestine is going to produce two really important hormones, cholecystokinin and secretin. Cholecystokinin, or CCK, is going to be produced by the small intestine. It's going to stimulate the pancreas to produce pancreatic enzymes. It's also going to stimulate the gallbladder, specifically the smooth muscle of the gallbladder, to eject bile. So now we got bile coming from the gallbladder. We've got enzymes coming from the pancreas. It also opens a little sphincter, we haven't looked at it yet, known as the sphincter of Oddi, or hepatopancreatic ampulla. And that's going to help open up the little routes, the little ducts that deliver bile and pancreatic enzymes. But we'll look at that in a moment. It also induces satiety, which is your sense of feeling full. That hormone, cholecystokinin, is going to do a number of things. The big one here to think about is to stimulate the pancreas and the gallbladder. Secretin also stimulates organs responsible for helping the small intestine, but it stimulates the pancreas to produce bicarbonate in order to buffer the small intestine, and it stimulates the liver. Instead of the gallbladder, this one stimulates the liver to make bile. You'll notice both of these hormones have an inhibitory effect on the stomach. So we're going to turn down the stomach activities, stimulate the liver, gallbladder, and pancreas in order to help the small intestine begin its activities. Here's a nice table summary of these three major hormones. So these are the big three hormones for your digestive system: gastrin, secretin, and cholecystokinin. The most important information on this table are the major effects. The major effects of these three hormones.